Coming to the fourth, so we have our research lecture starting here now. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Irwin. She's actually bachelor's from Washington University in St. Louis, and then German and history. That's right, and you'll give us a little glimpse into that. And then University of Maryland for your PhD. Okay. So Dr. Irwin's actually in, this is the one that I always get the department, agricultural, environmental, oh good, it's up there for me, and developmental, or some of our development economics. So I don't want to steal her thunder with the title here. I'm basically working on land use and how that land use affects the water quality and the economics of the region. Dr. Irwin's got some funding from Ohio Sea Grant. She does some fantastic work. She writes some very strong proposals. She's also got funding from NSF in the Department of Agriculture. And so actually you've got some recent awards too that you sent me in your bio. So in 2008 you were the recipient of the North American Regional Science Council's Hewings Award for Distinguished Young Scholars in Regional Science, and you were a co-recipient of the 2009 Sustainability Science Award from the ESA, the Ecological Society of America. So pretty fantastic accomplishments there. So I don't want to steal any of your time.
Right.
What we always do for our guest speakers is to have them give us just a little synopsis in the beginning of what their career was like, what kind of path they took to get to where they are now, and then delve into your talk for tonight.
Well, yeah. Thanks a lot, Chris. I actually really enjoy talking about sort of my path because I had a very nonlinear path, and so I like to encourage students to say that it's okay to not necessarily be on a linear path. And you know, if you feel like you're on a path and you're locked in and it doesn't feel right, then do something about it. You know? So that's for me. It wasn't that I was really locked in. It was just I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I had so many interests, and some of those interests happened to be in history and German, and so I thought, well, that's what I want to major in. It did get me to Germany to study for a year, my junior year abroad, and that was a pretty fantastic experience. And then when I got out, I went to my parents and I said, hey, would you give me $200 so I could take this bartending course so I could have a job for the summer? And they said, absolutely no way. No, we're not going to do that. You're going to have to go figure out what you're doing with this now. And so that forced me to look around and really sort of be a little introspective in terms of thinking about what I wanted to do. And I landed an internship with the City of St. Louis Parks Department. They hired me to draw trees, even though I really didn't have an art background too much. But by happenstance and hook and crook, I ended up getting into environmental issues and working in that area for the next 4 or 5 years. And that's really when I sort of discovered my real interest in terms of environmental problems, and really from a human and social science perspective. And that's what led me to then seek out a graduate degree and eventually PhD in environmental economics. So, not a linear path, but one that I found, and one that I found just by sort of really trying to figure out what it is I was very interested in and truly passionate about. And so that's what I encourage all students to think about. So tonight, I want to talk about sustainability. Oh yes, there are the lights, and so now no one is looking at me again. So as we were talking about in our little group session, everyone, all the attention is on the PowerPoint. I titled my talk today "A Sustainability Science Approach to Lake Erie," because I wanted to really emphasize this idea of sustainability and sustainability science. And I'll talk more specifically about what that is here in a minute. It really, though, has to do with the integration of sciences. And we talk a lot about biological sciences and natural sciences here at Stone Lab, but many of the issues, as the RUEs really emphasized in their presentations that we've just got to listen to, emphasize other aspects, the economic aspects, the social aspects, the human aspects, the policy questions, the management questions. And so when we're thinking about Lake Erie, we're thinking about an integrated system, a system that involves both natural and biological and biophysical processes, as well as human and social, economic, and policy processes. And so that's what we mean by a sustainability science approach to this. And today I'm going to talk specifically about Jeff, what do I do in this case? We didn't cover this with the RUEs.
That's okay.
Well, it was just working.
Looks like we're frozen up, Matt. Or Kevin.
So what I want to talk specifically today is thinking about this integrated approach to thinking about land management, and particularly agricultural land management, and Lake Erie water quality. Okay. I think we're good. Great. And what I'm going to talk about today draws from a current ongoing research project, so this is really still very much work in progress, including some stuff that we've just been working on this summer. And as you can see, it involves a large group of people, because when we're talking about doing integrated models and interdisciplinary stuff, inevitably you're going to be working with lots of people. So here's another piece of advice for you. When you choose to work with people, choose to work with nice people. And everyone on this list is a nice person. And I say that from experience, because I've worked on interdisciplinary projects, and I will not name names, of course. But if you work with someone who isn't particularly collaborative, it can be just a black hole of energy and of resources. So, yeah, pick nice people to work with. That's another piece of advice from me. But we've gotten some funding from the NSF Coupled Human Natural Systems Program, and also just recently from Ohio Sea Grant Program. And basically what we're doing here is developing a set of models that can help us to integrate from the land use in the watershed, specifically looking at the agricultural land use and land management practices, integrating that with the runoff, looking specifically at excess phosphorus coming into Lake Erie, what the implications are there for harmful algal blooms. But we're not stopping there. We're then asking the question, how does that translate into what economists like to fondly call ecosystem services? And so we're thinking about Lake Erie ecosystem services, which, as this arrow represents and implies, are the benefits that humans derive from nature. That's the definition of ecosystem services. And so when we think about Lake Erie ecosystem services, we can go down a long list of what these ecosystem services are. We talked about some of them just now, but drinking water supply to 11 million people, a $1.5 billion sport fishery, the walleye capital of the world, many, many marinas, the largest percentage of charter boats among all of the Great Lakes. All of that adds up to coastal county tourism and jobs that total in the billions of dollars. And so this is significant in terms of the value of these ecosystem services to society, to the economy, and to the public interest. Now, here I say it's a two-way linkage between Lake Erie and the well-being of people. So we have this arrow coming from Lake Erie to benefiting to people, but we also have a reverse arrow. And that reverse arrow that we're interested in looking at are what are the human impacts then on Lake Erie. And here we're thinking specifically about impacts in terms of excess phosphorus being generated by our land uses and land management practices in the basin. And so about 2/3 of this comes from agricultural practices in the watershed, which means about 1/3 comes from non-agricultural practices, for example, sewage treatment plants, combined sewer overflows, which is a huge problem in Ohio. Many of the big cities, as well as smaller communities, are dealing with that problem. Lawn fertilizer runoff. So this is not just farmers applying fertilizer. This is everyday households just over-fertilizing their lawn and fertilizer running off. Water treatment plants and septic tanks, of course, also contribute to the problem. And as we have been learning a lot about specifically today, generating the problem of harmful algal blooms, among other things, which has clear and obvious impacts then on the value of these ecosystem services that we care about. And so when we put this all together, we have what many would refer to as a coupled system, a coupled human-natural system, where you have these linkages going both ways. All right, now these are not the only linkages that are out there, but these are the linkages that we're going to focus on, and we are focusing on in our research with this project. Now, the other important point here, though, is that these human impacts, humans are rational beings. I mean, we're engaging in these activities because there's some benefit. And obviously, there's huge benefits to the agricultural activities that are going on in this watershed. So, just for example, taking just the 2012 value of agricultural production just in the Northwest Ohio Crop Reporting District, which is a lot of that Lake Erie region, we had corn totaling $560 million in sales, soybeans totaling $659 million in sale, wheat another $79 million, and livestock another $424 million. So these are not things to sneeze at. These are part of the benefits of how we are using our land and the benefits that we as society are getting from that land use. And so when we think about this from an economics point of view, we're really thinking about how do we weigh these things. There are benefits to the land use and land management practices that are going on in the watershed. There are also costs. So when we think about this question of reducing excess phosphorus to improve Lake Erie water quality, there will be benefits from that in terms of these improvements in ecosystem services, but there are also costs. There are going to be opportunity costs for farmers if they become more regulated or it becomes more costly for them to operate in this environment. And of course, there are policy costs for all Ohio residents if we assume that the costs of those policies are borne by the taxpayers of the state. So continuing on the economic viewpoint theme here just for a second, I'm going to draw a graph, all right, and it's going to have a dollar sign on the vertical axis, just warning you, coming. All right, so, but on the horizontal axis, let's think about this. So we're going from a highly eutrophic situation, right? Lots and lots of phosphorus runoff. And I know I'm really simplifying the problem here. I know it's not just phosphorus runoff. Many of you have talked about that earlier this evening. But, let's simplify just for the sake of argument here and think about this in one dimension. So thinking about highly eutrophic lake, lots of phosphorus running into the lake. On one end of the spectrum, on the other end of the spectrum, we have a beautiful oligotrophic lake, very clean and lots high value in terms of those ecosystem services. So as we move along here, we're thinking about reductions in phosphorus loadings that are going to lead to these improvements in Lake Erie water quality. And so the key question is how much? How much reduction do we, as a society, thinking about this from sort of a social good perspective, do we want to try to achieve? Well, let me be so bold as to say that economics might be able to provide at least some guidance, if not the full answer. But if we think about this in dollar terms, we do have ways in economics for valuing these ecosystem services, right? So think about the value of decreasing the morbidity rate of walleye. Who was looking at that? Somebody was. So think about the value of that in terms of the increase in the benefits to sport fishermen and the value in terms of the generation of additional dollars. Right, so we can put a value on that. We can put a value on other things such as improvements in water quality that reduce drinking water treatment costs. So there are ways in which we can think about how we value these things. So let's just for the sake of argument say that we could actually do that. And we could draw this curve that as we reduce more and more of these P loadings, we're going to have this total benefits curve that as we reduce more and more, these total benefits in terms of these improvements in ecosystem services are going to be increasing. Now, the way I've drawn this curve is to suggest that these might be fairly steeply increasing at first. So initially, these improvements in reducing the loadings is going to be really, great opportunity for improving these benefits. But as we do more and more, it sort of starts to level up. Now let's think about what the cost might be, because we don't have a free lunch, right? That's the standard quip of economists, and it's almost always true that there are no free lunches. And so we think about, well, what are the costs of implementing these things? There's going to be a cost. There's going to be a cost of a policy. So, for example, if we're talking about requiring farmers to engage in certain best management practices, we have to be able to enforce that somehow. So there has to be an enforcement mechanism. That's going to be costly. Or if we're talking about payment for ecosystem services, this is a very effective way of encouraging these best management practices, but not with a stick, but with a carrot. Right? So if you engage as a farmer, for example, in regular soil testing, and incorporation of the phosphorus into the soil rather than broadcasting it on top, for example, then we will incentivize that by offsetting your costs, or in essence, giving you a payment for providing an improvement in that ecosystem service. But that's costly, right? We got to come up with those revenues somehow. So as we think about what the cost might look like, they might start off, we're going to go with our best opportunities first, the low-cost stuff. But as we try to reduce more and more, it's going to get more and more costly. So the cost curve might look something like this. Okay, so here's the $6 million question, whatever that number would be these days. Where do we want to be? Back to this question, how much? Have I given you enough information to solve this problem? You're saying yes.
Kind of. I mean, it's definitely kind of a, depending on who you ask, I think you're going to get different answers, and also the limits of the cost. But.
Okay, if you believe, let's also say another caveat. Let's say you believe the curves that I've just drawn here. Have I given you enough information to answer that question? In other words, should we be here? Should we just try to reduce loadings by this much, or should we be all the way over here, where benefits are higher? We want to do the difference, right? We want to do net. We want to maximize the difference between total benefits and total costs. We want to maximize net benefits, in other words, because that's where we're going to have the greatest gain to this reduction in phosphorus loading. And so in economics, we're always looking for where that greatest difference is, where we're maximizing the net benefits, in other words. And so we would call that an optimal amount of reduction, of reducing the amount of phosphorus loadings. And so economists like to use words like optimal, but it basically just means that this is where we have the right balance between looking at the benefits of an action versus the cost of that action. And in fact, we're maximizing those net benefits. So that's all great from a conceptual point of view, but how do we do that? I mean, there's all kinds of challenges involved with quantifying these benefits and costs. Although I just cavalierly told you, yeah, we can do this. Okay, but this is really complicated, right? Part of the challenge is that there's a lack of markets, that oftentimes these ecosystem services don't actually have a price associated with them. And so if you use some pretty sophisticated methods to try to get at what that price might be. Likewise, pollution is an externality. There's no price associated with that. So how do we assign a cost value to that? But probably even more challenging is the fact that these are complicated systems that we're talking about. Complicated ecosystem dynamics, complicated biophysical relationships, and complicated social processes. When we apply a policy, we think we might know how someone might respond to that policy, but do we really? So maybe we double the price of phosphorus. What is that going to do? How might farmers respond? Well, if they're profit maximizing, presumably they're going to reduce that input because now it costs more, but by how much? I don't know. It depends on what we would call their elasticity of demand. How sensitive are they to price? If we double the price, is that going to do anything for improving Lake Erie quality, or is it just going to put a huge burden on the farmers because we've just doubled the price of one of their inputs? Don't know, but that's an important behavioral question. And of course, there are many, many trade-offs. There are many kinds of economic activities that are generating these benefits and costs, and many types of ecosystem services. So this is why we need the sustainability science approach. So what is sustainability science? Well, the National Academy of Sciences has actually defined this as a new scientific field that integrates across not just the natural sciences and the social sciences. So natural sciences being things like biology, physics, hydrology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But also the social sciences, including economics, sociology, policy, political science, anthropology, as well as engineering, medicine, and public health. And really the focus here is not to build the most complicated model you can, but really the focus is to solve policy challenges. And that's the other thing that is really interesting about sustainability science. It is oriented towards scientific discovery, but scientific discovery for a purpose, explicitly for answering policy questions. And so the focus really is on developing integrated science to help guide policy. And key methods include not just data analysis and the scientific method that we're all familiar with, but also modeling, and in particular integrated models, so that we can use these integrated models to try to understand what future scenarios might be. Right? You've heard of climate change. You've probably heard of some of the climate change scenarios that get projected from the big climate change models, the big global climate change models. Well, these are referred to as scenarios, where we're doing scenarios not to predict the future, because we know we can't really predict the future. No one can predict the future. But what we can do is use our scientific knowledge to build these models to try to project plausible outcomes under a given set of assumptions. And that's exactly what the climate change models are trying to do in many cases. And that's what we're trying to do here with our research project. We're trying to put together an integrated set of models, not so that we can predict the future, what's going to happen if we put a phosphorus tax on, what's going to happen if we encourage these types of best management practices, because we can't predict the future, but we can, based on this data gathering and empirical analysis that we do, based on the scientific knowledge that we have that we use to build our models, develop a plausible scenario of what these future outcomes might be, with the goal of helping decision makers to sort of bound these things. If we do this policy, then this range of possibilities is plausible, could occur, right? And so, of course, here we're thinking about ranges of possibilities being in terms of improvements to Lake Erie in terms of water quality, as well as costs to farmers and land management practices. So the main research questions we have as part of this project: what are the costs and benefits of reducing phosphorus loading to Lake Erie? Which incentives are the most effective for reducing phosphorus, and in particular the dissolved reactive phosphorus runoff from the farm fields? So if we give farmers a certain set of incentives in terms of perhaps cost sharing with best management practices versus something that would be more regulatory, for example, a tax, what are the trade-offs there? What are the costs and benefits of each of those, and how are farmers responding? That behavioral piece again. And then also we're doing some surveying of the public at large, to understand what kind of public support might there be for these kinds of policies, which is also a very important question from a public policy and communications point of view. All right, so today, with the remainder of my time, which is
27 seconds. No, just kidding.
I want to share with you just some examples of what we're doing here on this first question. And in terms of putting this together, we have this is sort of the whole schematic now of how we might answer this question of benefits and costs of reducing phosphorus loading. What we're thinking of here is we're building a series of models that start with the policy. So we're starting with policies, and we're thinking about, through a series of economic and social behavioral models, how are farmers responding in terms of their land management decisions to various policies. And to understand that, we have to know, well, what are the drivers here? What are the variables that influence these land management decisions? Next, once we have an understanding for this land management decision making, then we need some land use and hydrology models of the watershed to understand, well, once the farmer has made these decisions about crop rotation, about how phosphorus gets applied, when it gets applied, where it gets applied, and we have some notion then of what the phosphorus is that's running up from the field, we need a spatial model to tell us how that is traveling then through the watershed, right, and into Lake Erie. And so that's what the spatial land use and hydrology watershed models are doing. And then we are also working with some people from EOB, including Stu Ludson and Mike Fracker, who's a postdoc over there, to look at the hydrodynamic lake model. And they have a three-dimensional hydrodynamic dynamic lake model that they're using to then understand, once the spatial watershed model has said, well, these are the P loadings that are coming into Lake Erie, what we then need to know is, how is that changing these ecosystem services that we care about? How does it change the water clarity? How does it change water quality in terms of drinking water? How does it change the presence, persistence, frequency, duration of HABs, which influence fish stocks? So Stu and Mike have a series of statistical models that they're working with, but they also have the three-dimensional lake model that they're working with. And finally, we then have an economic analysis to tell us what the value of these improved ecosystem services are. And so in the end of the day, what we're doing is comparing apples to apples, so to speak, because we know what the cost of these policies are that are being imposed, and we can use this integrated model to understand what the potential benefits are in terms of these improved ecosystem services. All right, so let me just give you a few examples. I want to focus on the stuff that I know best. So we're going to focus on some recent work that we've done here in terms of data that we've gathered looking at farm management decision making, and then I'm also going to share an example here of recent survey of anglers, recreational fisher people, looking at how they might value a reduction in HAG. All right, so here's the example of the farmer decision making. We worked with Robin Wilson, Brian Rowe, and others to send out 2 mail surveys to 7,500 farmers in the Maumee watershed. The Maumee is the largest watershed in the Lake Erie basin and has about 85% of the land dedicated to agricultural use. We did this earlier this year, between January and April 2014. We gave farmers $1 along with the survey, just to sort of give them some incentive to fill out that survey and send it back. We got about 38% response rate, not too bad. I've been involved in surveys in the past, by the way, where we've also raffled off OSU football tickets. So that's a good one. That gets up the response rate as well. So we have about 2,500 responses to work with, which is a really very nice sample. The survey was divided into 3 parts. We polled farmers on their farm characteristics, the characteristics of their operation, how big is it, what's the mix of crops, etc. Operator characteristics, so the characteristics of the farmer themselves in terms of age, income, years of experience in terms of farming, etc. And then we said, think of a field, think of a specific field that you manage. First, tell us what the quality, the general land quality of that is. Is it low? Is it medium? Is it high? And then we ask a bunch of specific questions about what are the management practices that you use on that field, and how much phosphorus and nitrogen and manure are you applying to that field? Did you apply this year, last year? And so we asked a lot of detailed questions about the management of that particular field. And so with that data, there's lots of things we can do with this data to better understand, again, the general question being, how do we explain the behavior that underlies decisions, particularly that relate to the amount of phosphorus that might be running off of a field. So those decisions would have to do with management practices in terms of how the phosphorus is applied, the 4 R's, right timing, right rate, right place, as well as other things such as soil testing and crop rotation, tillage choices, and a number of other related land management questions. So here is some work that my PhD student Wendong Zhang has pursued for some of his dissertation work, is to look at how sensitive, coming back to this price sensitivity question, right? So if prices of fertilizer doubled, would farmers respond? Would they actually reduce phosphorus levels, or would they not? And so he's just recently, within the last couple of weeks, gotten the survey data and done some analysis of a fertilizer demand model where we've looked at that question of price sensitivity. So I'll spare you the details of the statistical model, but the general results so far are, first of all, thankfully, we're getting a negative price response, right? That's what you would expect. As prices go up, your demand for fertilizer goes down. So thankfully not an unsurprising result there. That confirms our basic economic theory. Interestingly, we find that on average, farmers' responses are relatively inelastic, meaning they're not that responsive. You could double price, but I'm going to not reduce my phosphorus loading by half, right? There's going to be less response there than the relative price response. But probably the most interesting thing is that we find that there are different types of farmers respond differently. So, for example, older experienced farmers have a higher price elasticity, meaning they're more sensitive to price relative to younger farmers. Or, for example, farmers respond differently depending on the quality of their land. If they have non-prime farmland, they're more price sensitive than if they have prime farmland. And so all this really matters if we're thinking about a policy that might affect the price of phosphorus, because how I respond to that price in terms of how much phosphorus I purchase and put on my land has a direct relationship to how much phosphorus runs out and gets into the lake. Right? So we really need to understand what this price elasticity and price sensitivity is if we're going to pursue any kind of policy that would have an effect on phosphorus price. All right, another example that I want to get to then, and I'm going to skip through this because I think I'm running out of time. But just so that you know, we've gathered a ton of land use data. What you're seeing here is the Maumee Watershed crop rotations in terms of, here's the legend, which you can't fully see, but continuous corn, continuous soybean, corn-soybean rotation, corn-soybean wheat rotation, and these are all color-coded. This is between 2006 and 2009. I'm going to show you now how that crop rotation pattern changed to 2010, 2012. Here's that. And so you can see that there's a lot of action going on in terms of how the crop choice and crop rotation patterns are changing. Although in aggregate, we have about the same amount of land in aggregate that is devoted to corn, to soybean, et cetera. But if we're interested in understanding the spatial impact, and that's really important when you're modeling phosphorus runoff, we have to be able to understand this at a much more disaggregate level. What we see here is there's a lot of action going on in terms of changes in crop rotation patterns. So the point here is that we would model this, and then these choices of best management practices, of fertilizer application, of crop rotation, all get fed into a spatial hydrology model, which Jay Martin and his former postdoc, Gebremarium, are looking at. And for those of you who are familiar with hydrological modeling, they're using SWOT, which stands for Soil and Water Assessment Tool. Essentially what that is doing is taking the land use as an input. It also takes other things like climate as an input. And it traces then the hydrological flows of that phosphorus to the mouth of the Maumee and into Lake Erie. All right, I'm not going to spend any time on that or the hydrodynamic model, which is also in here. I want to skip to the last set of slides, which has to do with then, once we know how the phosphorus running off is changing the ecosystem services in the lake, we still have to get that apples-to-apples comparison. We want to know what the value is of that. And so a common way that economists would talk about that would be in terms of willingness to pay. How much would someone be willing to pay to reduce the number or the intensity or the duration of paths in Lake Erie across a season? And so Brent Sanjan, along with Wendong Zhang, this summer also have been working on a survey that did just that. They sent this survey out last year, and they've more recently been analyzing the data from that. They surveyed 3,000 anglers, recreational fishermen, through the ODNR fishing license database within Lake Erie general region. And they asked them a series of questions that focused on their fishing experience and their habits. And so, for example, one of the things they did is they divided the fishing areas up into this grid, and they said, circle the grids that you go to most often, and circle the boat launches, these triangles here, that you leave from the most often. The ones that are circled in red were the highest chosen locations. They also then did what's called a choice experiment. They said, well, what if you were going to go to a location and you had choice A and you had choice B. So you could go to site A, you could go to site B. Site A and site B vary in terms of several key characteristics. Specifically, they vary in terms of the catch rate, in terms of the miles of algal bloom that you have to boat through to get there, in terms of the water clarity that you see, in terms of the time to get there, in terms of the distance from the boat ramp. Which one do you prefer? Do you prefer site A? Do you prefer site B? This gives us a lot of hypothetical data then that we can use to estimate a model. And from that, we can then estimate willingness to pay values in terms of dollars. And so here are some of the examples of the estimates that they got. So for example, fishermen, on average, these recreational anglers are willing to pay $119 for an improvement in water clarity with one site visit, one fishing experience, that changes the water clarity from very murky to very clear, for example. In terms of the HABs, so if you could reduce the amount of HABs, specifically that you had to boat through to get to your fishing site, by 1 mile, fishermen are willing to pay $13 for that. Okay, so these are small numbers at an individual level, but then you add these up, thinking about all the fishermen, thinking about all the experiences over the course of the season, and you can get some pretty big numbers. Okay, so these are meaningful in aggregate. So we also have plans to value other ecosystem services, but that's pretty much what I have time for. So let me just conclude by saying that this kind of integrated modeling, we'll never get it right? We'll never really be able to perfectly predict anything, but what we're trying to do here is to build these plausible outcomes based on the scientific knowledge that we know about behavior, about ecosystem processes, in a way that integrates across the human and natural processes, and in a way that can be informative ultimately for decision makers who have to grapple with these exact questions, but yet in the absence of this kind of modeling. And so the modeling is really intended, at the end of the day, to be a decision support tool to inform those decisions. So, thank you, and I will stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Chris, want to lead this?
Sure. Does anybody, any questions for Dr. Irwin?
Yeah.
So these might be different numbers, or I might not be thinking about them in an economically correct way, but you talked about in the beginning about the $11 billion just in the Lake Erie County in tourism dollars, and then you talked about the agricultural sales, which barely just kind of got over $1 billion. Why do we even do agriculture? Or why don't the tourist counties just buy out the ag land and stop the problem?
Well, that's not politically feasible, number one. But from an economics point of view, I mean, those numbers aren't really, they're not captured, those are highly aggregate numbers that are very imprecise, actually. They're not capturing a lot of things. They're not capturing the numbers that I threw out there for 2012 were just literally for that small Northwest agricultural district. So they're really not very comparable. And they're also, that's just looking at the final sales. It's not looking at the land value. It's not looking at a lot of other things that would impact what we would call broadly farmer welfare or social welfare. Right? So profits would be one thing, but other things also would come into that welfare, including land values and values of other assets, for example. So I wouldn't, it's a good point. Your eye was drawn to that, but I would not use that in my benefit cost analysis.
So that big change in the 3-year crop cycling, was that driven by the whole biofuel market, and then because it looked like everything switched to more corn and more years of corn?
That's exactly what was going on. There's essentially a switch to. So switch away from, for example, a corn, bean, wheat rotation to just either continuous corn or corn, soybean. Something that was more intensive in terms of corn. And you can point directly to increases in price over that time period and commodity prices that were driving that. There were increases both in corn and soybean prices during that time. But you saw definitely in the Maumee at least intensification of corn.
Matt, are there any questions from the online audience?
No. I got two quick ones. One is just, I want to make sure I would be interpreting this right, and the other one, I want some insight from you. It would seem to me that part of this is evaluating it on sort of our willingness to pay the cost and the benefit, but that, because you throw human health into this, and dangers associated with illnesses and worse, that could totally throw out, or at least totally modify that, our idea of just picking what makes the most sense as far as picking the net benefit. Am I right?
Well, I would include improvements in terms of drinking water quality as a part of that benefit. So if we think about ecosystem services, ecosystem services are broadly defined as any benefit that humans get from nature. And so certainly a healthy lake that helps reduce our treatment costs for drinking water would be an ecosystem service. And so we think about the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment came out with 4 different categories of ecosystem services, and one is provisioning. And so that would be a provisioning service where we're getting our drinking water from a healthy lake ecosystem.
The other question is, I thought it was incredibly valuable to see the cost-benefit rate pick the maximum net benefit. That was helpful. Could you also be helpful for us in, often I've heard economists say that the best incentive programs are coupled with some kind of equally effective disincentive program.
A carrot and stick approach.
Exactly. And how do you choose how much of each?
No, that's a great question, and that goes to our second research question, which has to do with how do farmers respond to different incentives. And so the survey that I mentioned that we were using to look at the price effects is also getting at those kinds of questions as well. And I didn't present anything that spoke specifically to that, but we have other work that looked at, for example, did a similar kind of choice experiment that I presented for the Angler survey, but in the context of land management, and looked at, for example, filter strip adoption. So you have filter strip A, you have filter strip B program. Which one would you choose, or would you not choose any? And so looking at different incentives in terms of cost sharing or outright payment, paperwork burden, all kinds of different factors that might be affiliated with different incentives to see which farmers might be more willing to choose. And how that is heterogeneous across farmers. Because as we found with the price effects, we also find the same thing with a lot of the BMP adoptions, that depending on the type of farmer, the age, the experience, the income, that they have different preferences in terms of that. But to answer your question more directly, I think incentives and payment, what we would broadly call payment for ecosystem services, we're going to pay you to do the right thing for the ecosystem. Right? That's a great policy because you're not punishing anyone. It's the other way around, right? You're incentivizing farmers or whomever is providing that ecosystem service by paying them. Then, of course, the question is, where does that payment come from? Right? I mean, the government doesn't have an extra million or, several million, whatever it would cost, lying around to finance this. And so that's where that carrot-stick approach comes in, because we could think about, for example, a tax. The tax maybe could be on fertilizer, because that is definitely an externality. And if we go with the polluter pays principle, we would want to put a tax, probably actually not on the fertilizer, we want to put a tax on the emissions. We actually would want to put a tax on what the impact is of that fertilizer in terms of Lake Erie. So if you happen to be closer to a sensitive point, closer to a discharge point, then you would pay more because your impact would be more. Now, politically, that's probably not going to be a very feasible thing, but from an economic point of view, that's how we would think about it. But you have to have some way of generating revenue. So taxing, polluter pays principle would certainly make sense. Another thing that makes sense is that the public benefits from these improvements in ecosystem services, and some of these are not paid for. And so a general tax or some kind of revenue revenue-generating fee that could then be used to incentivize farmers is another way of thinking about it.
Very good. I think we have time for one more question.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm imagining that there are other groups of people, and maybe you work with these folks too, that look at cost-benefit analyses with an education component for. And where does that get categorized?
We have, so one of the persons that's working on this project is Robin Wilson, and she's a behavioral scientist who works in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. And she distinguishes between what she would call hard policies and soft policies. And hard policies would be the kind of things I just talked about. The soft policies would be more that kind of thing. So information campaigns, education, outreach, those sorts of programs. And she's done some work, again, through some of the previous survey data that we collected that suggests that both approaches can be effective. And because we find, for example, that farmers that are younger, that have a stronger environmental sort of stewardship ethic.
Age differential in that earlier slide.
Yeah, that they actually do feel that they could and want to do more. That was a direct response from the survey. So there is, I think, a role and certainly room and scope for those kinds of quote-unquote softer policies. Okay, one more.
Oh, you're going. Good.
Yeah. So, on the models you're proposing to the decision makers, what's kind of like the temporal scale? Like, is it like months, years, or decades?
Oh, that's a great question. So our models are, that's a challenging question from a science point of view, because, if you guys are modelers at all, you would know, you know that these lake models are defined based on hours and days and, and for an economist, I mean, people don't change, they do change their behavior, but they don't change it that rapidly, right? And so we tend to think of it in terms of month or quarter or a year. And so bringing these models together is challenging for that reason, because they can be defined at different temporal resolutions. But for policy, we're thinking of, you have to be able to take these time lags into effect, because we can change what happens on the landscape. It's not necessarily going to translate immediately or even the next year into a change in water quality. And so we have to be thinking at least on a decadal time frame.
Great. We can thank Dr. Irwin.
Yeah. I think we'll move right into our guest lecture for tonight. And first, some quick announcements around the room. Dr. Marshall, anything for the evolution course?
Dining hall open at 4 to 7. Your dining covered normal. Hopefully you're at 7. So make sure the pile of stuff in the classroom is on the boat, including our laptop. Make sure all stuff is on the boat. I think we're going to go bad birds as soon as we get back.
Where are you going to band first, Mark?
20 minutes back.
Very good. Dr. Kane, ecology.
Morning, couple of lectures, and then afternoon we're going to Dutch Woods to look at forest community composition. So changing the long pants and long sleeve shirt, because there's lots of cool stuff I do on the way to them.
Dr. Simon, ichthyology.
Yep, midterm tomorrow. So that ain't fun.
All right. Dr. Hogarth, fields up.
We have a night field trip tonight, right after the lecture, do that stop, over South Pass.
Dr. Beatty, limnology.
We're gonna be having an exam on Saturday. I'm the bad guy this time around on Saturday, but, and we'll also be measuring primary productivity in the, water column of the lake on Saturday.
Matt Thomas, laboratory manager. Any announcements, Matt? Thanks.
I think we're good.
Good. Kristen Stanford, education, outreach, snakes.
We're good. I think Kevin's going to make an announcement.
Kevin Hart, our assistant lab manager. We're Kevin, just
Oh, he did? Well, then I'll make the announcement. Any students, we are looking for some of you, hopefully, that might want to continue to stay at Gibraltar and work for us. We're looking to fill maybe 3 positions. So if you are interested in extending your stay with us at the lab, please talk to any one of us, but probably Kevin would be your best source of information about that.
And are we talking 2 weeks or 3 weeks? 3 weeks. 3 weeks additional stay. And what kind of great jobs do we have for them?
You would be working at our outreach facilities, which include our Aquatic Visitor Center, the Southwest Island Lighthouse. You'd be doing some general laboratory assistance with potentially, we have extended REUs that might require assistance at times. or just general lab upkeep, so.
We have a number of special outreach programs that would come up during that period of time. Science writers and county commissioners and a number of other special groups that will be coming up during that. It could be helpful. It's a good experience. It's a really good experience. Any other announcements? Dr. Chaffin on the research side. Okay. Any word on our buoy installation?
Still waiting on Coast Guard.
Coast Guard approval is what we're waiting on. Good. And it looks like the video cameras are all working pretty well, what I can see. Very good. All right, now I'm really pleased tonight. Our guest speaker is Dr. Bruce McPheron. Dr. McPheron is the Dean of the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences at Ohio State. He's also our Vice President for Agriculture Administration. Do you know Stone Laboratory and our Sea Grant Program, Center for Lake Erie Area Research, our consortium of 12 universities? We fall under the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences and also under the Office of Research at Ohio State. So Dr. McPheron is incredibly important to us, and the support that we get from that college, not just for our teaching that you see going on right here, but also the outreach support that we get for our extension program. We have 6 extension agents along the shoreline in a number of different offices. All of them work in association with the College of Food, Ag, and Environmental Sciences at Ohio State. But I really think of Dr. McPheron as being one of us as he comes in here, and I think you'll hear that in his background. And Dr. McPheron, I'm going to ask you to also say a little bit about how you got into this. And I'm not going to focus on I'm not going to say anything about the 3 primary focus areas that you got, because I think these focus areas, as far as the target areas for where this college should be focused, and I think they fit in incredibly well with the things that we're all concerned about right now on Lake Erie, on the Great Lakes, and quite frankly on all of the water bodies around the state. But an interesting background, and also let me say something first about the magnitude of this undertaking that he has. Because I don't know if many of you recognize, you come from a lot of different schools, how big the College of Food, Ag, and Environmental Sciences is at Ohio State. You got 3,400 graduate and undergraduate students. You have 2,100 faculty members. It's the only college at the university that has a office, I should say faculty and staff members, but it's the only one that has an office or representation, some kind of a presence in all 88 counties around the state. I'd like you to say a little bit about OARDC at Worcester, an absolutely incredible facility. At any one time, OARDC, when it comes to agricultural research, and this is agricultural and environmental research, and you heard from Dr. Irwin, and that was a fabulous talk, Dr. Irwin. Yes. Elena, every time you come up here, I'm really pleased with the things. Yeah, and you make me question myself. It's also very, very good. 400 projects underway at any one time at OARDC, and some really cutting-edge science, amazing things. But he started out here in Ohio as a entomology major. So he's probably going to be really concerned about the things that are the collections that are going on right now, Dr. Hogarth, in your classroom. Was a 4-H county extension agent in Ohio in the early 1980s. About 1988, he went to Penn State and held a number of leadership positions at Penn State. First associate dean, the director of the Ag Experiment Station, or the OARDC version in Pennsylvania, and had been the dean at Pennsylvania since 2009, when we were able to recruit him to Ohio State, and that was in November of 2012. Research on insect genetics, lots of work on fruit flies, and I'll ask you to talk a little bit about that and how you got into this business, and also the mistakes that you made along the way, because we've all done that. And really an international reputation connection with work right now, and really work going on right now in Latin America, Africa, and Australia. Australia would be okay. I would think about going over there if it water issues over in Australia. Bachelor's degree in entomology with honors from Ohio State, master's in biology, and a doctorate in entomology at the University of Illinois. That's as much as I'm going to say, Dr. McPheron. Also, I should add, lots of leadership positions within the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities and leading all kinds of programs in there. I think we're incredibly fortunate to have a person that is coming back to Ohio, coming up now to Stone Lab for first visit up here, but knew about Stone Lab from many years ago, and as an entomology person, he understands what it is that you're doing. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce McPheron.
Oh, Jeff. Those of you who've come to know Dr. Reuter know that he's really good at this. He just told me what to put into my talk. So we'll forget the slides and we'll just fill this in. Actually, I think I'll be able to weave a number of these things in, but you asked a recovering professor to speak, and so I've got this standard quiz that I do, and I only use it, just like a good lawyer, I use the quiz when I know the answer already. But this is a puzzling crowd to me, so I'm going to do the quiz anyway. We heard from the students, those of you who weren't here the first hour, we listened to students, a lot of different institutions represented, a lot of different majors, but here's the question for you tonight. How many of you, show of hands online as well, how many of you would characterize yourself as intimately involved in agriculture every day? Well, interesting. The rest of you skipped supper? When you pulled up to the gas pump and it say contain 10% ethanol, what does that mean to you? Knock on wood. Agriculture is intimately involved with you every single day. I wouldn't have predicted it with this audience. I would have thought that I thought I'd see more hands than this, but what we saw was less than a third of the people in the room, and I can tell you from having done that with literally tens of thousands of people in audiences over the past 5 years, that is the average response. And it usually happens right after a nice buffet lunch. People just don't get it. Agriculture is not me. I'm a foodie, but agriculture is not me. So here I am, leading a $250 million enterprise, which is roughly the budget that it takes to run a college like ours at the Ohio State University, about $250 million a year. Just a poor little entomologist trying to make his way. Jeff gave you that background, and I started at the age of 11 determined to be the best entomologist that I could possibly be. And yet here I end up talking to you about how to run a college. Where did I go wrong? Well, I can't answer that question. All I can tell you is that there is a very illogical, logical progression to how I got here. And Elena touched on this when she was talking to you at the start of her presentation. 11 years old in Ohio 4-H, I discovered bugs and knew I wanted to be an entomologist. Life directed at becoming an entomologist, and in Ohio, the place you went to become an entomologist was the Ohio State University. So that's where I went for my undergraduate degree. Went off directly into a PhD program at Illinois. I was going to be an insect ecologist. And in fact, I was studying with a very prestigious scientist at the University of Illinois in insect ecology. And about the end of the first year, he went on sabbatical and said, get good data. And I said, how do you do research? He came back, and I had a really interesting project all set up to do in the field and got it deployed. And darned if the deer didn't eat my entire control plot out of the experiment, which for those of you who are doing research this summer, you understand that that does put a little wrinkle into how you analyze your data if you suddenly have no control to compare your experimental design to. Well, your story, Elena, was, you know, what do you do with history in German, and when your parents won't give you $200 to learn to 10 bar, you know, you've got to actually make some real-world decisions. My real-world decision was, golly, you know, maybe this isn't what I want to do after all. So I actually left graduate school with a master's degree. And I came back to Ohio, Maryland, and I moved back to southern Ohio. And after literally casting about for nearly a year, I will disagree with you on one phrase, I became an extension educator. Okay. I use that very explicitly, and I'll talk about that a little later. And I worked in 4-H, our youth program, for 3 years. And what I learned from that was the importance of communication and how to teach in unexpected classrooms. And I learned that I really did want to be an entomologist. And so I went back to grad school, and then you hear the rest of the progression. A successful career at Penn State that led to increasing responsibilities and eventually gave me the opportunity to return to Ohio State. What I want to talk to you about is completely different from what you heard from Dr. Irwin. She was very clear on the science that she was discussing. She has the ability to go very deep into the areas of her scholarship. I'm going to describe to you what I characterize as the veneer of the college. We can come back to talk about bugs if you want, but I just want to give you an overview of a lot of the things that characterize the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences. I'll call it an agricultural college. But there are a lot of things that I think are quite surprising in terms of what we do. And it actually relates beautifully to what Elena talked about, because she talked about the importance of systems thinking. When I listen to the REU students talking about their projects, there's systems thinking in there. These projects, you've got specificity and depth, but they're interconnected. And you change one parameter, and it's something somebody else is working on, and now you come together, and you actually learn things that you never, ever could have learned alone. And I do like your advice to choose good collaborators, to work with good people. Let me tell you a little bit. We may have to go back to the whatever magic worked before, the reset. Perfect. Jeff mentioned this, a little bit about our college. We are in every corner of Ohio. And this is true for the land-grant universities of the nation. And Ohio State is, last year at this time, I said it is the land-grant in the state of Ohio. This year, my line is it's one of 2 land grants, because Central State University down in Wilberforce, Ohio, down in Clark County, or Greene County, has actually been added to the role of land-grant universities. But in our case, we have a presence through cooperative extension, outreach education, not only in every county, but in every community in Ohio. It truly is a portal to the power of the university, and I'll talk about that. We'll begin with a little bit on cooperative extension at the end. We actually have reached a point of more than 3,600 students. About 500 of those are in fact, at our Worcester campus, with about 650 undergraduate students all studying for a 2-year degree, 72% of those students are first-generation college students. It really is an access point for students to come into our fields. We have great success in training our students. We do extensive surveying at graduation and follow-up over the next several months. And within 6 months of graduation, they're either continuing their graduate or professional education or actually employed at a rate of over 90%. We like to think that that's because they get great classroom experiences, but because of the quality of teaching we do outside the classroom also. Our students are involved in clubs and organizations. Almost 95% of our students in the college have at least one internship when they graduate. Over 40% of our students have an international experience while they're with us. In fact, the 2013 graduating class, 52% of those students have had at least one international experience, and many of them reported multiple trips overseas. I think you'll recognize this location. What I want to focus on over the next few slides is just an overview of some of the things that you may think less frequently about when you think about a College of Agriculture. For us, we've actually added it to the name. We have an environmental focus as well as traditional production agriculture and all of the value-added components of agriculture that follow along from harvest. But the environmental component is a really central piece of what we do. You heard in Elena's talk discussion of some of her collaborators that we have the School of Environment and Natural Resources within our college. That is actually the second largest major in our college, following only animal science. And those students are also very highly successful. It's a little different demographic than some of the students in our other majors. Those students are even less likely to come from what you would consider a farm or agricultural background than our students in the animal and plant sciences. Taken all together, only about a third of our students come from a farm background. And so in those 3,600 students, the majority of them are in fact people who didn't grow up in growing and producing food. They all, of course, grew up in consuming food. So there is that nice connection. The environmental component is really critical. You heard a wonderful exploration of some of the facets of this in Elena's talk, but we've got wildlife and fisheries management. We have a brand new major that is one of the fastest growing majors at Ohio State, the EADS major, Environment, Economy, Development, Sustainability. It's only 2 years old, and it's gone from 0 students 2 years ago to nearly 150 majors this year. And so it's just bursting at the seams. Students really are attracted to this and want to take advantage of what we have to offer. Interestingly, about 2/3 of the majors in that new major are taking the economics track, the financial sort of track. They're interested in that component. And so when you think about the technical seminar that you just heard, that's the crop of minds that are going to go into that field and really engage in some of that kind of problem solving. So we feel that this is really a pretty special opportunity for training. You know, clearly what happens up here at Stone Lab is a great addition to all of the work that we do, but it really extends far beyond Lake Erie. But you saw the maps. Even when you get far from Lake Erie, you're often not that far from Lake Erie. In addition to the kind of work that Elena was talking about, we have scientists who are looking at the edges of fields to try to understand how the application system, the drainage system, the cropping system all relates in the movement of phosphorus from the planter out into the waterways. It's just an incredible web of people looking at different aspects of this issue. As you move south of the Lake Erie drainage, we're interested in the hypoxia issue in the Gulf because we contribute through the Ohio River drainages into the Mississippi and the issues that they're facing. You know, it's not just Lake Erie that gets green. We've ruefully joked about Grand Lake St. Mary and whether or not you're going to water ski or play putt-putt golf over the course of the summer season on that. Buckeye Lake, East Fork Lake down in Claremont County, very far-flung places are dealing with some of the same kinds of issues that we see here. So the research that we do here and in these watersheds actually has statewide, national, and even international implications in terms of identifying the best way to proceed. We have been very interested. Jeff referred to the fact that we've got these focus areas within the college. One of the things that was very attractive to me when I was talking to folks here at Ohio State about coming back into this leadership role was the trajectory that the university was taking. Then President Gordon Gee sat down with me and he said, let me tell you about where the university's heading. He said, we're going to focus over the next 10 years on food production and security, energy and environment, and health and wellness. Those are our three discovery themes. Those are our Ohio State's grand challenges. I thought maybe I had wax in my ears and hadn't really heard. I thought maybe he was talking about the college. He was talking about the university. So what an exciting opportunity to come and lead a college that deals with all of those things and have the university at your back in terms of scholarship. So over the next decade, we expect to see an investment in as many as 500 new faculty working in areas around those three topic areas. And it's even more perfect because it fits exactly with the priorities that the college had. So food production security, environmental security, and biomaterials were very important areas of the college's focus. One of the things that we've been focusing on for about 5 years is a great partnership with a little company named Quasar. Quasar was a startup from Europe. They brought biodigester technologies that have begun to mature in Europe and tried to get a foothold in the U.S. And the place they chose to start was our Worcester campus in the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center. And they chose that for a variety of reasons, not the least of which were faculty who were working in fermentation biology and very interested in looking at the interface between energy production and agricultural production. We had a question a little bit earlier, I didn't catch who was asking the question about whether some of the transition in land use was driven by bioenergy and ethanol, corn to ethanol. Clearly there's a component there that you've got competing uses for a product and it has a dramatic effect on a price. Well, there are also other components of how you relate agricultural production to energy, including some of the stuff that comes out the south end of a north-facing cow, but also a variety of different sorts of byproducts of the food processing industry. And Ohio is an incredible player in food processing with nearly 1,800 companies located here in the state. And so you actually have the ability to look at some very creative ways to actually feed that energy production process. And so we partnered with Quasar. They built their first pilot facility on that Worcester campus. And they have subsequently moved to not only other locations with the same sort of food-related input, but they're now bidding successfully on projects with water treatment plants at small to mid-sized cities across the Midwest, looking at actually being able to generate additional energy. Now, there's a lot of research on the topic still here. This remains a really important science-based component as well. How do you change the blend of bugs inside, not my kind of bugs, of course, but the bugs that truly drive the world, the microorganisms. How do you change that balance depending on what kind of feedstocks are coming in order to generate the product that you have going out? What do you do with what's left over in the bottom of the biodigester? You know, if you're putting in agricultural products, you have a sense of what's actually in there. Once you start putting human waste through sewage treatment plants, what happens to all those pharmaceuticals? You know, one of the questions that came up earlier was endocrine disruptors, which operate at vanishingly small concentrations. What's happening in that whole cycle? When you have to clean out that biodigester, where does that actually go? You know, how does that balance when we talk about competing the cost-benefit ratios? Right now, if we're landfilling all of these things, if we're just dumping them untreated into water systems, what are the implications? Those are all great researchable topics that are going to take the next generation of minds to sort out. And this university-industry partnership model is one that's going to become much more apparent and much more important. This particular graph actually talks about a relationship that Quasar and others developed, and we had a part in it with the Cleveland Browns in the National Football League. I was up at the game when the Steelers beat the pants off of the Browns, but then everybody beat the pants off of the Browns. But they found the magical quarterback, so their worries are over. Yeah, I doubt it too. There was rumbling from the crowd that disagreed with that generalization. But the fact is that they are a winner in terms of actually trying to become a zero food waste stadium. And so they've partnered with InSinkErator, the people that bring you the little grinder in your sink on a giant room-size scale to grind up food waste and actually feed it into the Quasar program to generate energy back in. A lot of really fascinating opportunities here. Okay. Biomaterials. We often think about fuel as biomaterials, but I would suggest to you that through time, with improved research, with a lot of capabilities, we will actually think about fuel as almost the throwaway value biomaterial. There are incredible materials, pharmaceuticals, industrial materials, that are present in plant-based systems. If we can only develop the technologies to extract them, and I would submit, if we've done the proper sorts of life cycle analyses to actually evaluate whether they are economically, ecologically, and sociologically sustainable. That's a missing link right now. That is a researchable opportunity. That's a scholarly opportunity that will be critically important as we go into the future. But we march ahead dealing with new technologies. You won't recognize this from your yard, but it's kissing cousins to dandelions. This is a dandelion species from one of the stands. I can never remember if it's Kazakh or Uzbeki stand. And Katrina Cornish and her colleagues, again at the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center, have been working on turning dandelions into car tires. Turns out that white sap, when you pick a bouquet of dandelions, if you choose the right species, actually has a lot of industrial properties as a latex. We have intellectual property protected now for latex-free or latex allergy-free glove materials from certain latex plants. And the work that we're doing in collaboration with Bridgestone Tires and Cooper Tires actually is looking to develop this as a potential industrial source for the tire industry itself. I would submit that right now we're probably, would be safe to say we're making tires for Hot Wheels cars. But the goal is eventually, you can't imagine how hard it is to grow dandelions. Yeah, that's the bottleneck, right? We've got great extraction techniques. We've actually built a pilot plant, so at not benchtop scale, but not commercial scale, we're extracting the latex and processing it. That part seems to be going pretty smoothly. We just can't get the plants to grow. So we will have somewhere in the neighborhood of 58 million dandelion plants in the ground this growing season, trying to find the right agronomic conditions. it's really sad when you've got to explain that your contributions to the world of agronomy is trying to grow a new weed. But Katrina's team has been going forward. It's a great story of looking at novel outcomes. But let me just reiterate what I said at the start of this little section, and that is, it's really important to think about what all the inputs are to growing the dandelions. Because, even though we think of them as weeds, they don't grow like weeds, and they do require fertilizer, and they require fuel of the planting and cultivation and harvesting process. They might require weed management for non-dandelions, in which case you've got chemicals that are derived from petroleum-based sources. And so all of this biomaterial, really fascinating, really exciting stuff, is not, in fact, divorced from the world of petrochemicals. And so we've got to weave these things together and truly understand what the actual costs are. The economists, can't build a model unless we can tell them what all of these costs are. So there are great opportunities to really examine that. Put this slide in a presentation I was giving in Cleveland and thought I'd leave it here. When you think about agriculture from the food end, we are, in fact, in every household in the world. One of the really fascinating discussions these days is whether we should get food from South America or from South Bass Island. The local food movement is really, really, it's on everyone's minds and lips. And I think there are some incredible opportunities to think about new science here as well. Well, okay, so what could that new science be? All right, here's one thing. The average age of farmers in the United States is a full human generation older than the average age of consumers. What happens when we run out? The fastest growing segments of new farmers are 1, women, and 2, people in what you might call niche agriculture, including local markets. And they're not interested in commodity scale production. They're interested in higher value propositions. And we haven't given them a whole lot of information. We haven't given them a whole lot of research-based support for what they're doing. Now, you can think about community gardening from reclaiming vacant lots. And there's value to that. I can take you to communities in Cleveland where our cooperative extension office has been engaged with a lot of community organizations, NGOs, and municipalities, and communities have turned around. You start these local gardens, and people paint their porches, and they fix the gutters, and a community that was declining regains resilience, and kids go back to school, and they succeed. There's important social value to that. How do we capture that, economists? We need to be thinking about that. We need to be thinking about that. But my argument would be there's a more interesting question yet. The demographers suggest that by the end of this century, somewhere between 85 and 90% of us are going to live in mega cities when you consider a global basis. Here's a question for you. Can a city feed a city? That's a really fascinating question. Maybe when you do all the kind of analyses you heard in our research presentation today, it actually makes more sense to grow food like we do now, out in the hinterlands with people specializing on it, doing it at scale, and then moving it by transportation to where it's needed. But that's not local. That's not, there are all of these expectations and aspirations about vertical gardening and vertical farming and all the wonderful things we'll do right in our own backyard. I'll tell you, I've done a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa. I've been in Malawi many times doing research work. Malawi is a country where 80% of the population is personally involved in growing their food. And they don't sit in rooms like this, folks. They don't have time because they're growing their food. You know, we've got to think about all the social balances. How do we want to produce our food? You know, that question about about whether we should be putting our food into biofuels. Fascinating question. You know, maybe we should, if we look at the values of $11.5 billion in tourism versus just the commodity level, say, farm gate sales levels of these commodities, and they're out of balance. Should we just buy out all of that farmland? Well, what is the cost of having our food produced in a country that we can't rely on? You may not think about this, but there's a cost to that. It may not be a cost today, but there's an eventual cost to that. All of these things have to be, it takes systems thinking. It takes putting together all the pieces. It takes each one of you training to be an expert in your discipline, but training to be willing to work with the person sitting next to you and bringing your ideas together. I've described creativity as a demolition derby. The county fair season, and a good county fair ends up with a great demolition derby, right? Where everybody sits in the grandstand, and you start out with a Ford and a Chevy and a Nissan and a Subaru, and they crash into each other, and at the end there's only one still working. And it's mainly a Ford, but it's got a Chevy headlight now, and it's got a door panel that came from a Nissan. Creativity happens when ideas crash together. And so the kind of thing you're doing here, where you bring people from a lot of different disciplines and you work together, that's the test bed for creating a generation of minds of scholars that will solve problems like this. Ohio State is a unique place. We are the nation's only urban-located college of agriculture that also has a significant underutilized urban land base. I have 300 acres of farmland in Upper Arlington, one of the priciest suburbs in Columbus. And right now, we're not really doing anything that matters to people in agriculture, to people in Ohio, to people in the nation, to people in the world. We could test these questions. We could look at what the true costs of intensifying agriculture would be. What's the carbon footprint? What can you actually produce year-round at a latitude like Columbus, Ohio, when you've got cold and you've got not so much light? Could you go vertical? Can you combine aquaculture and horticulture in these units? There are lots of testable questions there. How could we work with the food bank system to actually work on distribution of produce that's grown locally? They're experts at this. There are just so many opportunities to look at this, to think about this in a different way. So that's one of the things that I find exciting about the opportunities here. And then food, the bane of our existence, right? My doctor tells me that I should not mistake running my mouth with exercise. It's funny the first time. It got a little less, it's funny to you, but it's a little less funny to me, actually. You know, we've gone through this national health care debate, which is not yet finished, still under discussion. If you were to take out diseases that are directly related to what we eat and how we behave, the national health care debate would be a dramatically different beast. If we were to subtract out obesity, diabetes, hypertension, things that are directly related to what goes in our mouth and what we do after we're done eating, it would be a very different world. one of the things our faculty are working on is actually how we can turn what we put into our body into less of a dietary challenge and more of a help to us. And so folks in food science and technology have been partnering with scientists in the James Cancer Center at Ohio State to look at a variety of different food components that have anti-cancer properties. I've done this a couple of times with state legislators, and it's a real treat to watch them. They're standing in front of a committee testifying, and you hand them these little purplish gummy bear type confections. And they're all taking a bite out of it, and you say, you've just become part of our FDA clinical trial on anti-cancer properties of these black raspberry derived compounds. And they quickly lay down the rest of their little gummy. While their aides are just shoveling them in like mad, it's really funny to watch. But the fact is, a lot of what is in our food is actually very good for us. And if we can figure out how to enhance that and how to deliver it in a way that's very bioavailable at the right levels, we can turn these into some great opportunities for enhanced and improved health. Another great thing that we're working on. Well, I told you that I would bookend, which is a hint that the talk is nearly done, with saying just a few words about cooperative extension. So in our college, we have resident education. We train undergraduates at the 2- and 4-year level and at master's and PhDs. We have lots of great research. Some of it, I think you've seen by now, very unexpected in terms of the kinds of things we work on. But one of the features of being a land-grant university is that we have in our DNA the delivery of that knowledge throughout society. And that's what cooperative extension is all about. It's celebrating its 100th birthday this year. Cooperative extension as a national system began in 1914 with the signing of a federal law called the Smith-Lever Act that provided federal funding to be matched by funding from each of the states for this program, which would ensure that the benefits of the research conducted at the nation's land-grant universities ended up in communities, ended up in businesses, ended up in households, solving real-world problems today. So through cooperative extension, our classroom is a church basement, a school auditorium, an Amish farmyard. We have incredibly diverse classrooms that allow us to take that information out. And you can think of it in a lot of different ways. How many of you have heard of Monsanto? Yeah, I thought so. You didn't know that you belonged with agriculture, but you've heard of Monsanto. Well, Monsanto just spent $1 billion basically creating cooperative extension. Monsanto's business is to use genetics to sell chemistry. Okay, that's their business model. Used to be a chemical company, but they discovered the best way to sell chemistry is to sell genetics. So they bought the plant genetics field. Well, if you're going to use the genetics in the field, you need to provide really excellent science-based advice on how to grow those plants. So they bought a couple of companies to basically predict weather and deliver information on how much to plant. So if you buy a seed from that particular company, you can actually buy a service where, while you're in the cab of the tractor, filling out your Sudoku chart, your tractor is keeping a straight line with GPS coordinates programmed in, and this advisor is not telling you, it's actually telling your planter behind the tractor how many seeds to drop per foot of row in order to maximize the yield of that field. It's based on last year's yield, it's based on the publicly developed soil maps for those fields. It's based on meteorological information, pest pressure, the hybrid that you're planting. all of these things come together in these predictive models to tell the farmer's equipment how to manage that field. Well, you know, that's exactly what we used to do. So now we've got to think of creative new ways to be relevant in society. Some of them will be going into those communities that are food insecure. Now, I know not everybody's from Ohio, but Ohio actually cracked a very unfortunate top 10 list last year. We cracked the top 10 list of food insecure states. 1 out of 6 Ohioans did not know where their food was going to come from at some point last year. And if you focus just on young people, the number is almost 1 out of 4. That sounds to me like a community that needs some science-based solutions. Whether it's social science, biological science, engineering science, or all of the above. That sounds like an opportunity to me. We look back at a history of extension. What we've done over 100 years is we have taken the power of the nation's universities out into the real world to solve problems. And so we're going to need to continue to do that for the next 100 years. Well, there you have it, an overview of what we do in the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences. I'll guarantee you learned at least one thing, and that is the next time somebody asks you if agriculture matters to you, the answer is yes. With that, Jeff, I'd be delighted to entertain any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. Questions for Dr. McPheron?
Yes.
So there's 3,600 students right now. How much has it grown, like, in enrollment growth?
Across the nation, undergraduate enrollment has grown since about 2005. That was really the low point nationally in undergraduate students in agriculture. Growth rates, our growth rate has been about 30% since over that time. Some of our peers have grown by nearly as much as 50%. So there's been a lot of interest. And it's not only the push from students wanting to come in. I mean, have you ever watched the Food Channel? Yeah, I think so. You know, you can't, whatever your medium of choice is, you cannot look at that without seeing something about food. That is, you know, everybody talks about food now. And so I think that's part of the push in. For most of us, how do I say this diplomatically? Well, there is no way to say it diplomatically. Animal science remains our hottest undergraduate majors. You know why? Everybody wants to be a veterinarian with puppies. And then they take their second semester of chemistry, and we help them find a new career. But we do. Remember, 90% job placement. We do help. I mean, there are lots of jobs out there for well-trained people in the agricultural discipline. So the jobs are there. So it's been a growth field, and not just at Ohio State, but nationally. A lot of people, we have a bunch of discovery majors. You know, not everybody discovers at 11 they want to be an entomologist. Most people at 11 can't spell entomologist. You know, I want to be, somebody was a microbiologist, I want to be a microbiologist, and they want you, you're lucky, you found something that, you know, you can really see the application, but, you know, chemistry, physics, hey, that's all of a sudden food science. And you start at $55,000 a year with a bachelor's degree. A lot of companies send you back at their expense for a master's degree, and it's all applied physics, chemistry, and microbiology. You know, there are great opportunities there, and we struggle to figure out how to market it because just like you, people don't think my college belongs to them.
Go ahead, Dick.
I was sort of thinking about the statistic you said where basically it boils down to farmers are a dying breed, and the fact that there is also maybe this new generation of, especially kind of the local farms and farmers markets, and that's become really popular. So I'm wondering if that might be the, you know, I know extension is involved with them, but if that might be the next day I noticed that the farmer had cut all the trees and stuff out of that stream. Like, man, that's not what we do these days. You know, we don't do that screens on farm agricultural fields. And then, you know, sometime later I was at the farmer's market talking to this local organic farmer and thinking, well, how great it is to have this organic farmer at the farmer's market. And it turns out that was the farmer who cut this.
Yeah, there are huge mixed metaphors in agriculture and food.
Yeah.
You know, actually, the biggest problem that agriculture has is agriculture. You know, the conventional farmers hate the organic farmers. Why? You're not competing for the same market. You know, get over it. There's room for everybody. You know, I'm sorry, but I'm probably going to continue to insist on coffee for a while yet, and it's going to be a long while till I can live here and have that be a local commodity. You can have a local roaster, but it's not going to grow so well here. Well, depends on your sense of climate change. But it may not be as long as I predicted. But the fact is that, you know, there are a lot of very nuanced decisions that go there, and you know, in Ohio, in Cooperative Extension, we actually have a series of signature programs. One of the newest signature programs is in the area of local foods and trying to address that issue. You mentioned farmers markets. That's really great, and a lot of farmers markets actually do accept food stamps. But if you compared shopping at a farmer's market with shopping at Walmart with your food stamps, you would get a lot more food for that family at Walmart. How do you answer that conundrum? You know, if I can actually turn my Waterman farm in Upper Arlington into a test bed where we can really look at the future of urban agriculture, I'll be very honest with you, I don't really care about feeding the people who shop at the Whole Foods a mile down the street, because they can buy their food anywhere. I care about people 2 miles the other direction, east of campus, where, you know, you have incredibly stressed neighborhoods. You know, how do we solve those inconsistencies? Those are really tough questions, and biology alone will not solve them. There's engineering, there's biology, there's soil science, there's sociology, there's political science, there's history. There's history. All of these things are going to be necessary. It's a systems approach. Go ahead, Elena.
So I was just wondering, do you have, if you look across the country at other colleges of agriculture, do you have good examples that you would consider to be good examples of colleges that have reinvented themselves and sort of along the lines, one or more of the lines that you were discussing?
Well, you know, Cornell has done an excellent job leading a campus-wide effort in energy sustainability discussions. And I think they've got an intent to take it further. The University of California system has just announced that they're tackling the issue of food on a statewide, system-wide basis. A lot of our smaller colleges have had the flexibility and the agility. And here's a funny thing, you know, colleges, universities that is where creative scholarship lives, right? That's where we come up with all the new ideas. But 3 times a year we dress up in medieval cloaks and celebrate our history. We don't move very fast in universities. If we had to exist in the private sector, we'd be out of business. We couldn't keep up. Can't change fast enough. So a lot of the change has occurred in some of the smaller colleges that have a little more elasticity in their operations. But, you know, I visited I don't want to pick on them, but I visited Kenyon College in Gambier over on the eastern side of Ohio. They have really focused on local agriculture, and they've reached a point where 40% of their food supply for their campus comes from local sources. And it was just fascinating to talk to these folks because they engage the student population. You know, the students they have courses around the decision-making process for how they engage local farmers and encourage them. They've got decisions that they make, but, you know, so they would buy local from Smith Dairy, which is about 50 miles away, but they won't buy local from Smucker's, which is 50 miles away, because Smucker's is an international company. You know, so there are value judgments that they have to make, but they actually debate and discuss this. So we finally came to the bottom line. I said to the guy who was hosting me, so compared to what you did before, when you just bought food on a commodity basis, how's it pencil out? What's it actually cost? He said, well, students pay $58,000 a year to come to Camden College, so we didn't actually have to figure that out. Well, therein lies the problem, folks. When we translate, we can do all these cool things on our campuses, and we can try to be agile and resilient, and we can engage our students, we can engage the smartest people in the world, our faculty. But if we don't ground this in reality, how does it ever go out into those communities? How does it ever actually change society? That's a tough question. Do you have a question or comment?
Well, I had a question about like how the company Montana kind of stuck to growth in like local farming just because of like technological advances. You have a lot of farmers these days kind of becoming very, I guess, one-minded in that it's all about the output of their farming. But when you have a local farmer and I guess a farmer with like, commercial farmer, how like levels out.
Now, I'm going to gently poke at you here, because this is a fascinating topic, and I don't know the answer to it. Those of you who gave presentations earlier, that's a good thing to remember, to practice saying that. I don't know the answer to that, but here's how I would go about thinking about that. You know, to begin with, there isn't a farmer who's trying to support their family who's not a commercial farmer. And so, you know, your question really is one about scale and about kind of the focus on, you know, where they're organizing their markets and, you know, what they're willing to grow. Very complicated set of questions, and you know, I don't really know how to drill down through them. I would just say this, you know, I'm not going to tell you what you personally should come to believe about the food system. But it needs to be resilient. It will need to rely, in order to feed 9 billion people, on technology, appropriate technologies. That's a really critical thing. I've traveled the world in my own studies, and I can tell you, I have seen the rusting hulks of farm equipment that our best intentions have left in countries around the world. It has to be culturally appropriate technology. Some of it will be served by multinational companies. You know, if we're going to complain about Monsanto, we better be prepared to complain about Apple and Ford and Starbucks. All of these are global companies. You know, so we've got to think about your job is to take your training and your creativity and your passion and actually turning it into figuring out the answer to those questions, because it's a tough one to sort out. It really is. So I can't really answer it. I'd be glad to talk more about it, but I can't really answer it.
Thank you very much, Dr. McPheron.
You're welcome.
Again,